Hindsight is 2020, or at least that's what they used to say. Now it's 2022. No one can ever really know what happens till it happens, but what about after when it happens? Who knows then? There's a clear line connecting one event to the next, but it's a line I dare not cross. When they cross, I Chris, and when they Chris, me Jack. You gotta remember who you are on these streets, and I'm the kind of guy that never compromises. Good guys, bad guys, tomato, tomato. Lettuce, cheese. Hold the onions, and a small fry. Small fry? Big Mac? Doesn't matter the size, it's about how you use it. Users and abusers end up losers, and you can't lose if you never play. You think this is a game? Well, it is, and that's time in the round. Checkmate. All of this is to say, how was I supposed to know that theming these things after a crime scene was gonna turn out so well? Yuji Naka might go to jail, where criminals live. Children, could you please gather around? I have some bad news about Balan. Okay, we're doing things a little different this year. Forces outside of my power have conspired against me with the sole purpose of ruining Balan Day. So we're flipping the script a little bit. But don't worry, kids, Balan's still gonna be right here. Although, for a majority of the story, he's not really gonna matter. And when he does show up, he's the least interesting part of his story, but it's just nice to have him. Yes, today we're talking about the post-release period of Balan Wonderworld. Lawsuits, scandals, and yes, even arrests have made it way more interesting than pre-release. But it's hard to tell a story without its main character, so for Balan Day 2023, we're gonna be going over the career of Yuji Naka. To many, an innovator and pioneer in the world of game design. To many more, a petulant, egomaniacal man-child with a bullheaded attitude that alienated everyone he ever worked with. It's a history littered with groundbreaking highs, embarrassing messes, and maybe the explanation for how the latest chapter ended in such a bizarre way. Yuji Naka's story begins all the way back in 1965, born in Hirakata, Osaka. A bunch of boring crap that isn't video games happens for a while until 1984 when his life finally has meaning. Yuji Naka decided to forego a college education to work odd jobs, which freed him up to work on programming. From a young age, copying programming notes out of magazines all the way to high school where he'd take a part-time job porting games, Yuji Naka was enraptured with the medium. By age 18, though, it became clear that you need money to buy things, so more stable income was required. That's when Naka was able to land a gig at Sega. Sega was looking for young programmers to beef up the library of the SG-1000, and wouldn't just hire programmers to work on the games, but also give them a place to live. Yeah, had to find this one out the hard way, so Sega constructed dorms for young developers to live in so they could be further trained in how to make games the Sega way. It was the college education he would have never gotten otherwise, and was also where the seeds were planted for further growth. After a few months of training, Yuji Naka and fellow programmer Hiroshi Kawaguchi would work together on an assignment to make games for girls, which would eventually lead them to Girls' Garden. I've been playing this game for 2 days straight, and I don't think I'm any closer to 100% completion. It was nevertheless a successful and impressive game for the fledgling duo, as they would be sent off to work in different divisions. Kawaguchi would be sent off to work on music for games like Afterburner and Outrun, with Naka being sent to work on various Sega games and ports. Leading up to 1991, he would work on games like Phantasy Star and Space Harrier, pushing the aspects of the Sega Master System that outshone Nintendo's Famicom. Fully 3D dungeons, amazing graphics, just about anything you could do to make the Master System sweat a little. When the Genesis hit the scene, Yuji Naka would double down on his efforts to make something you couldn't get anywhere else. He'd request console revisions to implement sprite scaling, which I'm reliably told would have been impossible, and to get special cartridges made for Phantasy Star 2. It wasn't until 1991, though, that he'd get to stretch his wings with a creation all his own. These two other people count as him, right? Mario wasn't running roughshod over the gaming landscape in the 80s, he was the gaming landscape. He was so popular, Nintendo could afford to paint the entire continental US for an ad. Sega, meanwhile, had Alex Kidd.
Well, he's got big ears. Kids are supposed to like big ears.
Sega would go on to hold an internal contest to try to figure out what to make, and when somebody suggested Teddy Roosevelt wearing pajamas, they realized just how bad things had gotten. That's when Yuji Naka was finally able to create an idea he'd always had, a hedgehog running through the forest to stop an evil scientist. It's the perfect idea! How'd he think of it? Okay, let's nip this one in the bud. So Yuji Naka is most well known as the guy who created Sonic, but in the same way that I'm the guy who created this frozen pizza. Yuji Naka was just one of 3 people that made concepts that would eventually coalesce into Sonic the Hedgehog. The other 2 people responsible for Sonic the Hedgehog were Naoto Oshima and Hirokazu Yasuhara. That's right, officer, it was all 3 of them. Naoto Oshima was responsible for the visual aspect of Sonic, including his Santa Claus shoes and Bill Clinton-like edge. You may know him best for his work on Tommy Lasorda Baseball. Yasuhara, while the least known of the 3, was the one responsible for level design. Don't take that as an undercutting of what Yuji Naka did for the original game, though. It'd be stupid to not recognize that his programming was the skeleton that those designs and levels sat on top of. It does undercut the idea, though, that he's the father of Sonic. If we're being honest, none of the 3 can really claim to be the sole father of Sonic. He was designed by a team. Of course, it's just a quick and easy descriptor. It would be a lot harder to introduce him as the guy who made it so Sonic can roll down hills. But the perpetuation of Yuji Naka as the sole creator of a character made possible by so many people would end up having some pretty obvious effects on Yuji Naka as the years went on. So, how was Sonic the Hedgehog received? Well, people keep drawing him next to Jesus. Sonic was a massive success, a console pusher and an automatic icon. While in the short term it was great, long term it would prove to make things incredibly difficult when developing a follow-up. The expectations for Sonic the Hedgehog 2 were high, and people were worried that Sega's killer app may have been a one-hit wonder. Sonic 2 wasn't even a priority for the company, instead focusing on diversifying the Genesis catalog with help from their first American branch, Sega Technical Institute. STI was a team made up of both young Japanese and American developers headed up by Mark Cerny, who you may know best for his work with PlayStation, and also Naka. You helped develop Jak and Daxter and Uncharted. They don't call you the Naughty Dog guy. You get named the lead architect of PlayStation in 2007, but they don't call you the PlayStation guy, but you make one knack! The team had a solid base in the form of Yasuhara, who was one of the first people that Mark had contacted to work with, not only to bolster STI, but also act as a guiding force for younger developers. The next person Mark was looking to headhunt from Sega of Japan was Yuji Naka, but when Mark contacted Sega of Japan about him, Mark learned that Yuji Naka didn't even work there anymore. Feeling undervalued and underappreciated for his work at Sega, Yuji Naka had flown the coop after development on Sonic was over. However, it seems like the stars had aligned for Mark because him and Yuji Naka were old programming buddies from the Master System days. With the promise of a pay bonus and protection from the prying eyes of Sega, Yuji Naka was on board for the very sudden start of Sonic 2's development. This may sound a little silly. Sega had poached Yuji Naka from Sega, but it makes a little more sense when you realize that Sega of Japan and Sega of America were 2 completely different beasts. It was a classic left hand doesn't know what the right is doing situation, except the left hand wanted to name Sonic's new sidekick Tails, and the right hand was wrong! So, how did Yuji Naka behave himself during this time? Yuji Naka is an arrogant pain in the ass. Artist Chris Stills recounted his time working on Sonic 2 in a November 2017 issue of Retro Gamer magazine. Yasuhara was a very easy person to work with, and I never felt he looked down on the Americans on the team. Yamaguchi was also easy to work with. Naka had no interest in working with Americans. Another artist for Sonic 2, Tim Skelly, would give a bit more of a measured take in a developer den done by the website Sega 16. Everybody attached to Sonic 2 ultimately worked for Yuji Naka. I think Naka would have been much happier if he was working with an all-Japanese team, but that's just because of the language barrier and some cultural differences. Imagine how you would have felt at the time if you were creating a Superman comic book and you were given a manga artist to do the artwork. The difference wasn't as extreme as that, but you get my point. It's often a point levied against Yuji Naka that he's xenophobic and thinks less of American developers due to the difference in workplace culture. Crunch culture is much more accepted in Japan, with developers expected to get the game done when they're told to get it done. For what it's worth, after having gone through the man's entire life with a fine-tooth comb, I don't think that Yuji Naka is a racist or anything, as little as his later actions would do to beat those allegations. I just don't think that American work culture is quite his speed. Despite the rocky development and polish applied up until the 11th hour, Sonic 2 still went on to become, at the time, the fastest-selling video game of all time, selling over 3 million copies in just 2 weeks. Having now been a large factor in 2 of Sega's biggest games, Yuji Naka had developed enough sway to make some demands. The first of which was that for Sonic 3, it would be an all-Japanese development team. He flat out refused to work on the game with any American developers, and would even go so far as to get his own wing of the STI building made that only his team could access. The only 2 Americans allowed into Naka's ocean of constant commotion would be Roger Hector, a senior coordinator at STI, and Pamela Kelly, a marketing manager who would be integral in making sure that Sonic 3 didn't stink. Early on into development, Yuji Naka wanted to bring his creation into the 3rd dimension, no doubt giddy to the point of passing out over the prospect of calling it Sonic 3D. However, Pam was able to stop his rampage by calling a hero on high, clad in only the greatest of gold. So, Pam had gotten together a deal with McDonald's to get Sonic 3 Happy Meal toys made, which meant the game had to release within a certain window to line up with the promotion, which scrapped the 3D idea. Leave it to the gringos to make shitty 3D Sonic games on the Genesis. While it wasn't as rocky as the development of Sonic 2, Sonic 3 had its own issues, almost all of which fell on the shoulders of Roger Hector. Hey, remember him? He was the only other American allowed to interact with Sonic 3's team, and had 2 jobs. He had to make sure that Yuji Naka had all the tools he needed, and that Japanese Sega employees weren't going to come and tamper with the game. This process was cataloged in Games TM, a UK-based gaming magazine with a terrible name. In it, he discussed aspects of Sonic 3's development, like the decision to split it between the base game and Lock-on Knuckles cartridge, Michael Jackson's involvement in the soundtrack, and Yuji Naka's leadership style. Naka was a strong team leader, and a good one in my view, because he listened to his team as individuals, but he made clear decisions and moved on. This did not always make him popular, but that was okay. So he was sometimes seen as being harsh, but that was not really true. I have a great deal of respect for what he did and how he did it. The results stand for themselves. Here's where you can see a bit of a habit forming in Yuji Naka's work, a my way or the highway style of direction, where other ideas would be taken into account, so long as they lined up with Yuji Naka's own original idea. This could be what led to the next major fracturing in the Three Stooges, as Yasuhara left the company after clashing repeatedly with Yuji Naka while making Sonic 3. Yasuhara would never return to Sonic, outside of special thanks in games as recent as Frontiers. He'd bounce back with the Floygan Brothers, and lesser-known games. When asked about his partnership with Yasuhara, Yuji Naka decided to pretend he didn't know who that was. So I was involved with every aspect of the original Sonics. Some of the details, like making a map, quite straightforward stuff, was done by the guy who's working on Jak and Daxter right now. He was involved until Sonic 3, and after that, for 8 years, he didn't do anything in Sega, so he was quite useless. We really didn't need him. He was really doing nothing with Sonic. With the original Sonic trilogy done and dusted, Yuji Naka was informed about the next big innovation from Sega, the Saturn. The 32-bit console was sold to him as an arcade machine in the home, with footage of Sega's Virtua Racing and Virtua Fighter running on it. What about the 32X? Hey, Sega said the same thing 6 months after they released it. Yuji Naka quit Sega to move to Sega and work as a producer. In his new role, his first move was to take what he did at STI and expand upon it, a private little pocket of Sega for him to be in charge of that would make games his way. That would become Sonic Team, and what better bottle to break against that ship than— what the f***? So looking at Sonic for too long is enough to exhaust anybody. Now imagine doing it as your job for the past 3 years. Yuji Naka and the newly reunited Naoto Oshima were eager to get away from him for a little bit and work on something new. This would become Nights into Dreams, a strange sort of dream ballet racing game where you'd pick between 2 anxiety-riddled children who'd retreat into a dream world with the help of a spindly spirit who wants to help them with their problems while also fighting back against the Dark Master who created them in the first place. fellas, is it gay if you plagiarize yourself? The game would end up getting its very own engine made to work alongside the Saturn's complicated rendering methods and would be delayed a full 6 months past its original publishing date. Despite the hiccups, Knights would go on to become a critical darling, getting rave reviews from hundreds of review outlets and becoming the best-selling Saturn game in Japan. It was popular enough to get its very own controller made to better suit the controls of the game. And if the power went out, you could always play fetch with it. But that's not the interesting story coming out of the Sega Saturn generation for Yuji Naka. Knights may have been a massive success, he may have gone on to produce Burning Ranger, but when you hear Yuji Naka and Sega Saturn, the only thing that comes to mind is Sonic Extreme. You think Sonic 06's development was rocky? At least it came out! Sonic Extreme was a game that originally started life as, let's just say, Sonic 4, and was meant to be the Sonic game made by STI as a farewell to the Genesis. While Yuji Naka and Sonic Team would work on Knights for the Saturn, STI would finish out Genesis support with a Sonic game, first about Tiara and Gazebo Babowski trying to get Sonic to protect the 6 Rings of Order from Eggman. Okay, so Americans got Tails right on the first try, but I'll be the first to admit we might have messed that one up. After that bad idea was thrown away, they decided to instead make a game themed after the popular Sonic Sat AM cartoon. Not unreasonable, an American-made Sonic game themed after the American cartoon, but what was unreasonable was shifting development to the 32X. This embarrassing growth was the last-ditch effort of a fading console to sniff relevancy that never got so much as a whiff. The 32X was a failure from the day it was born, and it doesn't really matter what you put on it, it was always going to just be a band-aid on a bullet wound. Regardless, STI was shafted and shifted over to the conjoined twin of the Genesis to continue work on the newly named Sonic Blue Streak. Then team lead Chris Sen realized that calling the game a streak was a bad look. Look out for Sonic Diarrhea-rama coming next year! After a few months of making sure that the piss patch on their pants was large enough for everybody to point and laugh at, Sega abandoned the 32X in a dumpster and once again jerked STI over to the Saturn. Okay, we can still make this work, guys. We just gotta band together, and where is the development kit? The team at STI was formed to make Genesis games. The developers only had experience making Genesis games. Barely anyone on the team even had a clue how to program 3D games, and even fewer knew how to program for the Saturn. Sega was begging for a failure by giving STI the task of making Sonic Extreme, and it would only get worse with their aggressive deadline policy. Holiday 1996 was the date they were given to work with, and in that time they had to figure out what a Saturn was and how to put Sonic on one. That holiday 1996 deadline was immovable as well, not only because the Saturn burned money in the same way that fireplaces burn wood, but because it was a tie-in. I would just like to give a quick shout out to Sonic the Hedgehog and the Wonders of the World, which came out. All of this, like I said, without a development kit, because Sega of America just doesn't have one. Sega of Japan only ended up sending them a development kit after they found out this was a game that was being made. One dev kit for an entire team is ridiculous, and led to one half of them using it to make boss arenas, as the other would be coding the levels with Windows computers. When porting the code to the Saturn, they learned that the work that they had done was too much for the Saturn to handle, and it was sent over to a third developer named Point of View. And from their point of view, they just got the keys to the castle. Without being asked, Point of View just started making their own version of Sonic Extreme, which started a full-on war between them and STI. Seeing as by this point not so much the wheels had fallen off, but the engine had exploded, President of Sega of America, Bernie Stoller, decided to help out the team. Now, here's where Yuji Naka finally re-enters the picture. Earlier on in Extreme's development, when the team realized they're piloting a boat, not a goddamn submarine, Yuji Naka saw what was happening, visited the studio, and said, "Hey! Good luck!" Oh, that's what we forgot! Later on, when Bernie Stoller entered the picture, he asked the devs what they needed to fix the game. They said that shiny new engine from Knights would be just the thing they needed to ice their wounds. Bernie provided and came back with the engine for the team to use. It was only 2 weeks later that they received an order to immediately stop using the engine and throw all the work out. That was thanks to Yuji Naka threatening to quit Sega if they continued using it, and as such, the game was doomed and would limp on to an embarrassing death, nearly killing 2 of its developers and dealing a fatal blow to the Saturn. Or at least that's the easy version of the story to tell. So I know we all know the story as Yuji Naka breaking into STI in a little devil costume and jabbing all the developers with a pitchfork while saying, "Ooh, hee hee hee, no Sonic for thee!" But shockingly, the story is a little more nuanced than that. Keep in mind that everything from this point forward is he said, she said, with few solid facts thrown in for good measure. First and foremost, Sonic Extreme was a complete and unmitigated disaster. Nothing could have saved this game. Its problems were built into its very DNA. The disastrous development of Extreme goes way, way deeper than just engine troubles, which speaks to a deeper issue of Sega being at constant war with itself. If it wasn't Sega of Japan or Sega of America leaving dead mice in each other's mailboxes, it was the teams at STI itself hating each other. During development, the art director got so sick of the artists being jerked around with what was required of them that the entire division grew to hate the developers and programmers. The team lead, Chris Sen, came down with an illness that nearly killed him. Another developer named Christina Coffin moved out of her apartment to live at STI so she could keep working on the game, and that led her to contracting pneumonia. STI was eating itself alive while developing this game, and it shows in the quality. Before I say anything, I know there's an enormous group of fans who are dedicated to, if not preserving, then full-on finishing the work done by the Sonic Extreme team, and that level of dedication to preservation is beautiful. This game looks like turbo ass. Fisheye lens Sonic gives me heartburn, loops in this game give me a hernia, and seeing the whole thing in motion gives me scoliosis. What would changing engines accomplish aside from making the team work even harder than they already were? Secondly, Bernie Stoller is not the kind man this story makes him out to be. He was a ruthless businessman who had an axe to grind with Sega of Japan that he would later try to plant in Yuji Naka's head. Bernie Stoller was made president of Sega of America in 1996, where he immediately took umbrage with just about everything about Sega of Japan. He wasn't a fan of more Japanese-centric genres like RPGs, he didn't like the Saturn and wanted to get rid of it as soon as he could, which led to him firing over 200 employees to start fresh, and most of all, he didn't like Yuji Naka. In his first trip to Japan to meet with Sega executives, he called out Yuji Naka as part of the problem and wanted him gone. Unable to get him to accept a gentleman's duel, he settled for the next best thing by getting the Knights engine out from underneath Yuji Naka without his prior knowledge. Knights hadn't even been released yet, and now the engine that was custom made for it was being shopped around to anybody who asked for it. If you found out that the engine you had made for your game specifically was being used without your consent, I can't imagine the reaction would be too much different. However, the opposite could also be levied in how Yuji Naka doesn't own the engine Sega does. If Sega wants to give it to another developer, they're well within their rights to do it. This part of the story comes down more so to interpretation, whether you see Yuji Naka lashing out the way he did as him throwing a tantrum, or him defending his creation against perceived injustices. Also, this entire thing may have not have happened. Chris Sen, the team lead for the game, addressed the rumor and called it as much, a rumor. I only heard that Naka-san was adamant about keeping the Knights engine private. I also recall a rumor that the Knights engine was shared with the STI crew. Not sure if Naka-san was asked, but if the rumors were true and he said no and then the engine was shared anyway, I would completely understand being angry, but all of this is speculation only. Yuji Naka himself also went on to confirm that the engine story wasn't true in the most Yuji Naka way possible by agreeing that this was a way for the devs to blame him for the shortcomings of their game. But it can't even be that simple, since the game's producer, Mike Wallace, said, "So, you know, they shipped us a Knights editor, a level-based editor, and our designers were familiarizing themselves with it. And after about 2 weeks, Yuji Naka had heard about it and said no." There was a big rivalry between Sega Japan and Sega America, and Yuji Naka hated SOA. So he went to the head of SOJ at the time and said, "Look, I don't want these guys to have the Knights engine. I don't want them to have the Knights technology. If you give it to them, I quit." So they went to Bernie Stoller and said, "I'm not giving you anything, you're gonna have to do without it." So Bernie had to come to us and say, "Sorry guys, you're gonna have to do it without the Knights technology." So some developers say it happened, other developers say it didn't. Both can't be right unless an evil doppelganger was involved. All in all, it's hard to tell who's telling the truth and who's lying. If you were a betting man, the best bet would be the correct answer is somewhere in the middle. With everything we have available to us, though, I think it's safe to say that Yuji Naka's hand in the death of Sonic X-treme was at best negligible and at worst non-existent. So Sonic X-treme gets dumped into a shallow grave and the Saturn along with it. Even with the bold new strategy of kicking the piss out of everybody who didn't have a Saturn, it wasn't enough. After missing out on a whole console generation, Yuji Naka would make sure that the Dreamcast would have a top-of-the-line Sonic game right out of the gate, or a month after the gate opened, it doesn't matter. Yuji Naka and his team focused their efforts on making the best game they could, and what better way to make sure your game is good than to staple a good game to it? Geist Force was a game being developed at Sega for the Dreamcast, a space fighter which could have been the console's answer to Star Fox. It was a big deal too, shown off at events like the Game Developers Conference. It was such a big deal, Yuji Naka himself wanted to visit the studio to see how it was going. Oh boy, the team must have thought. The guy who made Sonic is coming to look at our game. I bet our cutting-edge tech is gonna knock his socks off. They were completely unaware of Yuji Naka's real reason for coming. The story is best told by Mark Subotnick on the Retro Hour podcast. First off, Subotnick, not a clever fake name. Second off, he recounted the visit as a very difficult experience. Without realizing that a lot of the Geist Force team spoke fluent Japanese, he began discussing with his team about firing everybody and taking the tech right in front of them. And it definitely didn't happen this way, but you can imagine he was talking to Sonic if it helps. He started talking about what parts of our tech they were going to take for Sonic, and then basically said as soon as they ship, fire everybody but one engineer who knows their system and roll him onto our team for Sonic. And our team heard all that, so you can imagine how they felt. This was soul-crushing for the team, who, faced with the prospect of working for somebody callous enough to declare his intentions of a mass firing to their faces, left in droves and canceled the game. Despite such a heartless move, the lack of Geist Force tech didn't impact the development of the Dreamcast's killer app, Sonic Adventure. The game would release to critical and commercial success, another home run for the boys in blue. Instead of getting straight to work on Sonic Adventure 2, working title, Sonic Team got an order from the top executive at Sega, Isao Okawa. They were gonna be in charge of making the next big innovation, a console-based MMORPG. Yuji Naka thought that idea fucking sucked. He didn't want to do it because he didn't even think it was possible, but with Okawa putting up millions of dollars in funding out of his own pocket, and more importantly, nobody else was available, Sonic Team was now in charge of a game-changing game. On top of the workload of making an MMORPG, the completion of Sonic Adventure saw their workforces fracture. Takashi Iizuka, Sonic Adventure's original director, made the move to America to work with Sonic Team USA on Sonic Adventure 2, leaving the team without one of its key figures. On top of that, a large group of developers, including Naoto Oshima, left the company after the completion of Sonic Adventure. The developers would go on to create the company R-Tune, which would later become Arzest, making, and don't laugh at this next part, they would go on to make Blinx the Time Sweeper. Back with the real success story, Sega was in a bit of a jam. Their MMORPG, Phantasy Star Online, was late by a whole 9 months, and they had just reported a loss of over $300 million in the year 2000. As a result, a few different changes were made. First was that the studios making up Sega were not to be treated as independent autonomous companies that could make decisions independent of what the wider Sega company wanted. What was the benefit of this? One of them's gotta have a good idea! That also meant that when it came time to elect a president of Sonic Team, Yuji Naka slotted in comfortably. On top of that, former marketing head Peter Moore was made president of Sega of America, for whatever that was worth, because at this point Sega of Japan had basically forgotten about Sega of America. Peter Moore, seeing he was working for Sega in the year 2001, tried to tell the Japanese heads of the now completely disorganized Sega Hydra that the Dreamcast was toast and they had to think of something new, quick. In response, the heads of the various teams of Sega got up and walked out of the meeting without so much as saying a word to Peter. Even with the bullheaded stubbornness of those developers, there was still one guy trying to do what was best for Sega. Top executive Isao Okawa had been in failing health for the last few months of the Dreamcast's life, and was trying to secure Sega's future for when after he passed. This included forgiving debt that Sega had accrued while he was president from money that he had lent them. On top of that, he would donate all of his stock back into the company for an estimated $700 million, and tried to strike a deal with Microsoft to include Dreamcast compatibility with their upcoming Xbox. While that last part never quite came to fruition, it's inarguable that it left left an impact on Microsoft, as much of the Xbox's library was made up of continuations of Sega franchises, including Shenmue, Panzer Dragoon, and Jet Set Radio. He would end up passing away on March 16, 2001, having done all he could to save Sega from itself. Meanwhile, Sonic Adventure 2 had finished up development and would release on June 19th to an audience that didn't exist anymore. Earlier in the year, Sega had officially announced the end of Dreamcast support, with reports swirling the same day as Phantasy Star Online's launch. Sega had finally been knocked out of the console race and now had to adapt to the nomad lifestyle. But just like with every major world event, we gotta ask, how did this affect Yuji Naka? So yeah, until the very final moments, I was really against Sega leaving the hardware business. In a way, I feel that had the decision not been made, Sega could have gone bankrupt, so maybe it was a good business decision. In the massive power vacuum left by Okawa after his passing, Yuji Naka had been able to consolidate even more power. Despite not being a studio head in any official capacity, unofficially he was running things. Even developers who should have had seniority over him, like Shenmue creator Yu Suzuki, answered to Yuji Naka. On top of that was Sega of Japan's bad habit of ignoring the world around them in favor of Billy Hatcher and the Giant Egg. Despite Sega releasing over 100 games in just 12 months, it was hard to tell if Sega understood what games people wanted. Arcadey games like Panzer Dragoon Orta and Toe Jam and Earl 3 weren't looking too hot in 2001, which saw the release of Grand Theft Auto 3, Halo Combat Evolved, and Silent Hill 2. Like a Peter Moore in a studio-wide meeting, Sega just chose to ignore the gaming landscape and plug away on a new Jet Set Radio game, while Max Payne was all the rage. That's not meant to be a jab at the quality of the games themselves, it's just that there's a reason those games are cult classics and not classic classics. Sega of America, meanwhile, was losing their minds, seeing the landscape changing around them and feeling the need to evolve. Given their decreased powers following the failure to produce Sonic X-treme, though, Sega of Japan wasn't going to listen to its American branch no matter what. That's when Peter Moore decided to take matters into his own hands. Peter went out of his way to get market research to prove to Sega what he already knew. I needed to prove to the Japanese that our brand was starting to fade away, and so I asked the focus group, a bunch of 18, 19-year-olds, a classic question. If a video game publisher was a relative or friend, who would they be? EA, arrogant quarterback, 6'5", walks in, gets the girl, nobody likes him, blah blah blah. Rockstar? That's your drunken uncle that shows up from Vegas once a month with a hooker on his arm and looking for money, and then he's gone again. Sega. Yeah, that's your granddad. Used to be cool, but even he can't remember why anymore. Some fingers of mine aren't as important to me as seeing the video Peter made. When Peter Moore went to Japan to talk with unofficial God King of Sega Yuji Naka, the conversation fell apart almost instantly. This is ridiculous! You have made them say this! Sega is a great brand! Nobody would ever say this! You have falsified it! He just gets in my face, so I say to the translator, tell him to fuck off! And the poor guy looks at me and says, there's no expression in Japanese. I said, I know there is. And that was it. That was the last time I ever set foot in there. Peter, if you can hear me, I love you. With Sega now in full swing as a third-party developer for the 6th generation of consoles, Sonic would obviously undergo a few massive changes. With re-releases of the adventure games, Sonic Heroes, and Shadow the Hedgehog, Sonic was anything but dormant at the time. Despite the wider company desperately laying down train tracks as the train was rolling, Sonic Team mostly managed to avoid the drama in favor of its own equally insane drama. Remember when I said that the teams within Sega were largely considered autonomous from the larger company? Well, during the 3rd or 4th corporate restructuring at Sega following the collapse of the Dreamcast, they realized, oh, we tell them what to do, and reabsorbed most of them back into the company. Most. Would you want Sonic that close to you? I think not. Now, Yuji Naka's position higher up at Sega afforded him a lot of benefits. The thrill of killing Geist Force is rewarding enough, but there was one major negative. Yuji Naka is a programmer at heart. He likes working with games, and his executive position wasn't giving him the chance to do that. Despite being a producer on every Sonic game since the Dreamcast's launch, he had never had a direct hand in the programming side, simply being the decision maker who told people what needed to be done and when it needed to be done by. Because of that, he really doesn't have much connection to the development of Heroes and Shadow the Hedgehog. When asked if he missed the creativity of development, a process he hadn't been involved in since Nights in 1996, he responded, "Yes, I miss that very much. When Sega's a little more revitalized, I would like to work more on that side of things, in order to realize that I'm working really hard." This response goes away to establish two things. Yuji Naka wants what's best for Sega, but he also really wants to get back to doing something. By 2006, he'd had just about all he could take of his job at Sega and left smack dab in the middle of Sonic 06's disastrous development cycle. This continued a curse of every Sonic game released in a year ending with a 6 being a dumpster fire, thankfully broken by, you guessed it, Mario and Sonic at the Rio Olympics. So Yuji Naka was gone from Sega, but he wasn't leaving without a parting gift from himself to himself, poaching the remaining dregs of Sonic Team who weren't already fractured between two games. Now, like Sonic Extreme, Yuji Naka isn't the guy that killed 06, but unlike before, he's certainly a lot more active in this murder. So the new Splinter Cell off of Sonic Team led by Yuji Naka would go on to form Probe, established a mere 2 months after Yuji Naka jumped ship. Despite the classification of Probe being an independent company, Yuji Naka was still very much working with Sega. Much of the capital to start Probe came from a deal struck with Sega that gave them first crack at publishing rights for Probe games in a right-to-first refusal agreement. Despite his desire to get out of Sega, it's clear he didn't want to burn the bridge. Probe also gave him back something he had lost at Sega: total control. In a 2010 interview, he discussed the deliberate decision to keep the staff at Probe small. Yeah, I think it's a really good size, even if we think on a worldwide scale. When it becomes like 100 people or 200 people on a project, at that point, I'm not really sure who's working on what. I know them, but I'm not sure what exactly they're doing, and I'm one of those people who really wants to be involved in the small details. And when the team is blown up like that, I'm not really sure who to talk to anymore. I think it depends on how you control your team too, but with my personality and way of making stuff, I really want to be involved in the small details, and it's easy to control in that sense. That sense of control over his staff may have been what led to this hilarious picture. Hey, come on guys, where's Donald and Goofy? I thought we were at Disney World for how much fun we're having. At least that guy's having a good time, I'm glad for him. That game he's holding is Let's Tap, a game for the Wii with a gimmick you're not gonna believe. It's a fairly simple rhythm-based platform racer with mini-games baked in. What's so weird about that? Controllers, right? Sometimes you need them, sometimes you really need them. But how much do you need to hold them? Let's Tap seeks to see by having you control the game with a Wii remote placed on a tissue box. You have to control it by tapping the box in specific ways to set off the Wii's motion sensor and move your character. The game tells you at the beginning to not just get a box for yourself, but everybody else who may be playing with you. This is the height of experimental, the sort of thing that would only come when you stretch the Wii's motion control gimmick to the very limits, and shockingly, it works. It works really, really well. I rate this game right next to WarioWare's Smooth Moves in terms of games that knew exactly what a Wiimote could do. All the ways they use tapping a box as gameplay is astonishing, and the creativity on display doesn't stop impressing from the start of the game all the way to the end. Let's Tap shows that maybe Yuji Naka was right to leave and work on something new if this was the sort of creativity he had built up. I'm serious, go out of your way to buy and try this game. It's only like $5 on eBay. Emulation, not really an option this time. So things are going pretty well at Probe, including releasing tons of iOS and Android games, partnering with Microsoft to make games exclusively for the Windows Phone. Well, now I gotta buy one! Their most popular game from this era was Ivy the Kiwi? If they write it that way, I'm gonna say it that way. Ivy the Kiwi? Boldly asks the question of, what if Kirby Canvas Curse starred a bird who had to give birth to an egg so big it rearranges its guts to fit? Yeah, I'm an Animal Channel now. you. I kid, of course. Ivy the Kiwi was a big enough success that it was ported over to both the Wii and DS, spreading its reach even further than the massive install base of Windows Phone users. But Yuji Naka was always somebody who was looking towards the future. These smaller games served a purpose, which was building capital for Yuji Naka's next big move. Yes, Yuji Naka was eager to get to work on a massive game, a spiritual successor to Knight's Rodea the Sky Soldier. Do you ever just assume that a game has an easy development cycle by looking at it? Oh, they must have gone through hell and back to get Hot Wheels Track Attack on shelves. Rodea the Sky Soldier is a game I knew happened, but I never would have guessed that the road to getting it done would have been so difficult. First things first though, and you can forget about ever hearing this again, Yuji Naka is completely blameless in how this game turned out. It was everybody else screwing him over for a change. So, Rodea was announced in 2010, set for release the next year after landing with publisher Kadokawa. You may be asking, who the heck is Kadokawa? I thought the same thing, so I decided to dig a little deeper. Oh yeah, I tore that Wikipedia article apart. Thank God it's one of those companies that doesn't really say what they do, but from everything I can parse, it's a publishing company specializing in television, movies, and books. What's so special about that? Well, going through what exactly they owned got me curious and made me look deeper, where I realized just how big this company is. For starters, their film and television division includes Dwango, which owns the Japanese video site Nico Nico, but also Spike Chunsoft. That's the same company that made the first 5 Dragon Quest games, the Budokai Tenkaichi games, and Dangi Rangi's Big Bear Surprise. In terms of anime, they own the company Enji, who made Uzaki-chan Wants to Hang Out and Trapped in a Dating Sim, The World of Otome Games is Tough for Mobs, both shows I'm clearly a big fan of. As well, they own Kinema Citrus, who makes Made in Abyss and Rise of the Shield Hero, 2 shows I'm told are one of the best anime of all time and hot garbage respectively. You think that's enough? Oh, we haven't even gotten to the best part yet. Alongside Sony and Tencent, Kadokawa owns 69% of FromSoft. Yeah, the Metal Wolf Chaos guys. All of this is to say that Kadokawa is an incredibly large and powerful company, and to give context to this next statement, they couldn't do anything right. So, remember when I said that Rodea was set to come out in 2011? Well, Yuji Naka delivered, and the game was completely done for the 2011 release date and sent off to Kadokawa for publishing. Except it just never came out. It turns out that Kadokawa wanted the game to be released alongside a 3DS version that they would make themselves. Except for all the things that Kadokawa is, a game developer wasn't one of them. They own game developers like Spike Chunsoft and From Software, but they themselves aren't developers. Well, then who would make the 3DS game? Kadokawa Games, a company I'm only 20% sure is real. In reality, it's just a game publishing wing for Kadokawa, which got the Wii version of Rodea and had to reverse engineer it for the 3DS. It has at least one real employee, Hitoshi Hasegawa, who did an interview alongside Yuji Naka, who spent the interview blinking out Morse code for somebody to come save him. Hitoshi himself is also a weird part of the story because while he was apparently the director on Rodea's 3DS version, he was also working at Grasshopper on Lollipop Chainsaw and Killer is Dead at the same time. Kadokawa had the game, and presumably its assets, to do with as they pleased, but for whatever reason, they just couldn't make it happen for years. In an interview with Polygon.com, an audibly defeated Yuji Naka sadly recounted what was happening with the game a year after he handed it off to Kadokawa. I want to ask the same question. We finished developing the Wii version, and we have already submitted it. That was around a year ago. But it seems like they're still considering the details of the 3DS version. It might be close to being finished, but we haven't spoken to Kadokawa in a while, so I'm not sure. Kadokawa never said they weren't gonna sell it, so I would guess they'll release it sometime in 2013 or so. Because of that, I'm not sure what's going to happen to the game. However, I'm very confident we were able to create a new type of action game. I really want a lot of people to play this game. It seems that Yuji Naka and Kadokawa had a failure in basic communication, and Yuji Naka wasn't allowed to know what Kadokawa was doing with his game. Little did he know that it was being chopped up and dissected to try to jam a Wii game onto a handheld. However, that process took so long that in the middle of development, the Wii U flopped on the scene. Enticed by that big, sexy gamepad, Katakawa knew where the money was and announced a port of Rodea the Sky Soldier from 3DS to the Wii U. Yuji Naka expressed his confusion and sadness with the idea in the same Polygon interview. One unfortunate thing about the Wii U announcement, it doesn't come with a Wii remote. So Rodea and all the other Wii titles I created, people won't be able to play with a Wii remote. They'll have to use the Wii U gamepad. I created the game specifically for the Wii remote, so it's going to turn into a totally different experience. I'm really down about that because Rodea is a really good game. So the Rodea game that Yuji Naka sent to Katakawa was designed to work with a Wiimote, and with the Wii U not guaranteed to have one, it put Katakawa in a pickle. How are they supposed to make it work? Wait, one developer said, fresh off cleaning his hair with his own spit. We already have a version of Rodea that doesn't use the Wiimote. Let's just port the 3DS version! That's right, the version of Rodea the Sky Soldier that would eventually release on home consoles was a port of a port. Porting games from the Wii to the 3DS is already something that it could only just about do by the time the new 3DS rolled around with games like Xenoblade Chronicles, and that was made by a studio famous for ports. Katakawa, meanwhile, is most famous for confusing Wikipedia. So take that already Herculean porting process and do it again, only this time you have to take something that you had to downscale to fit the game onto a postage stamp and upscale it back to a disc. This could only end in disaster, and by 2015, 4 years after the game was finished, we finally got to see that disaster for ourselves. Rodea ended up releasing in a very, very bad state, soaring right into the bargain bins thanks to muddy and gross-looking visuals, a frustrating upgrade system that required you to grind out what was essentially an on-rails shooter, and the obvious inexperience of the team shining through. Much of the same was said about the 3DS version, but the failures of the Wii U version cannot be overstated. For years, Rodea was hyped up as the successor to Knights from the creator of Sonic. Yuji Naka's name and status were plastered all over a game that was unrecognizable from the version he submitted. Lucky for him, though, there was a way to fight back. Included in first-run editions of Rodea the Sky Soldier was the Wii game. A fully functioning alternative version of the game was included as a bonus, and when the few viewers that played Rodea compared the two, the Wii version was said to be leagues ahead of the other two versions. My advice? Buy Rodea the Sky Soldier for the Wii U, toss the Wii U disc into the nearest sewage canal, pop the Wii disc into your machine, and let her spin. The quality of what was marketed as a bonus disc, though, didn't do enough to save the game, as Rodea went on to sell just over 2,000 copies in Japan in its first week, and sold so poorly overall that it didn't even break many sales charts the world over. Yuji Naka, having suffered for nearly half a decade as he watched his creation be fumbled, mishandled, and broken, could only muster the following for a eulogy. Rodea the Sky Soldier will be released today in North America. Please play the Wii version. Rodea's failure was a lethal blow to Prope, as by 2017, only 2 years after its release, Prope was down to a single employee. Who could this mystery man be? Fucking shittiest game of Guess Who I ever played. However, that lucky lad wouldn't have to wait much longer because in 2018, Yuji Naka was offered a job at Square Enix. Without any other obligations, it was a win-win for both sides. Squeenix got a seasoned developer specializing in a field they lacked in, and Yuji Naka got to keep the lights on. And as soon as he became an employee, just like what happened with Sonic Team, Squeenix would isolate him from the rest of the company. A team of developers was assembled for Yuji Naka to lead on whatever project he wanted. Initially, though, he tempered his expectations. Just like with Propa before, Yuji Naka was gonna start small before building up to, presumably, another attempt at making Knights a thing. That structure wouldn't last long, though, as president of Squeenix, Shinji Hashimoto, would insist that Yuji Naka tap into his bread and butter by making a platformer. Alright then, fuck mobile games, we're releasing this bad boy on anything that's got a screen! Our team is really excited to be working on new tech. I hear the specs on the new Samsung fridge are amazing! The structure of Yuji Naka's new company, though, would be a little different and maybe not exactly what he was looking for. The company, forebodingly named the Balan Company, wasn't a developer per se, but rather an idea factory. The people who worked at the Balan Company were talented artists, designers, and creative types that would develop the world of a game, its characters and themes, before sending it off to an actual developer to do the heavy lifting. This idea factory style of game development can have massively varying levels of success, as the same team that can make Azure Striker Gunvolt can also make Mighty Number 9. It really comes down to who is executing those ideas that makes them flourish or not. And who was the team that was developing this new game? Well, it turns out the right studio came right out of Yuji Naka's past, because Arzest was selected as the developer. That's right, the same team that Naoto Oshima started all the way back when Sonic Adventure released was back into the fold. This wasn't even the first time the two had reunited, as We Play Motion was a game developed by several studios, each handling individual mini-games while Arzest handled the programming. Imagine asking one studio to make We Play Motion. Afterwards, they'd continue working with Nintendo, and even head up a few of their major franchises like New Yoshi's Island and Pikmin games. Ah, sweet! Which Yoshi's Island and Pikmin games? Who wants to know? You're writing a book? This was a perfect storm, a brand new mascot platformer made in a renaissance of the genre by the two people who created Sonic the Hedgehog, backed by a company so flushed with cash from Final Fantasy XIV they could just buy all the people who didn't like the game and kill them? Nothing could go. So things started going wrong before the first day of development, as Yuji Naka was informed in no uncertain terms that this was his one shot. If he couldn't make it work, he would just become a regular old employee like everybody else. No companies within companies, just plugging away on RPGs. Something he wasn't exactly keen on. I think Square Enix has an RPG image, but I don't think I'd be good at making RPGs. What? With everything in place, though, it was time for development to start on Balan Wonderworld. And that development was a complete mess, for reasons I can both talk about and not talk about yet. What we know for solid fact is that Balan's development was incredibly open. People were allowed to work on whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, however they wanted. The game's development lacked focus in major areas, most infamously the gameplay. Balan Wonderworld, despite banking on the nostalgia of its developers' previous works in the 2 ads it ever got, was a kids' game. The team was worried that kids would have difficulty adjusting to so many different movement abilities present in platformers from back in the day. Fortnite requires OSHA certification to play properly. You think these squirts can't backwards long jump? As such, Balan Wonderworld's main gameplay was hacked down to its bare nervous system. 4 buttons? Unnecessary. 3 buttons? Get out of town! 2 buttons? We're not launching rockets! No buttons? Whoa, calm down. Balan Wonderworld would be controlled with a single input. Your control stick would move you around, and every other button would jump. Now, single-button gameplay has worked in the past. Kirby is a golden goose despite its simple controls, Smash Bros. Is a world-class fighting game with only a few more than that, and even Yuji Naka's own Sonic was able to carry Sega with just 1 button. Except those games were those games, and this is Balan. So, how would Balan supplement that anemic moveset? Costumes! Yes, Balan Wonderworld's big selling feature was the fact that your player character could suit up in a variety of different outfits to overcome any and all challenges. Oh, okay, well, with a group of well-defined power-ups a la Kirby, perhaps those simple controls wouldn't matter. It's fun to make believe. 80 costumes were made for this game, 80 distinct costumes that would, allegedly, do different things. Keep in mind that Kirby maxed out with 28 copy abilities and star allies, and to this date only has 68. In every game combined, including spin-offs. Balan, meanwhile, was looking to nearly quadruple that amount on his first time out. The reason all these costumes were implemented was because of that loose development cycle I talked about, where any idea was taken into consideration and not too soon after put into the game. During the proposal stage, I wrote down it would have 80 different types of action, but I thought that once I actually started making the game, I would run out of steam at around 40. In game development, it's extremely common to start big and then get beaten back into reality when you realize what you can actually do. It doesn't matter how small the project is or how many A's it has, overambition like that can sink a game entirely. Look at a game like Duke Nukem Forever, where enough was never enough for its director, and eventually its bloated corpse would wash up on the Steam sale page. Balan sought to counteract this by doing it so much that eventually it would roll back over into being a good thing. This next quote comes from Noriyoshi Fujimoto, who, despite how it sounds, actually wants you to buy the game. To give an example of one of our crazier costumes, there's the Lucky Egg costume. It's a costume where you wear an eggshell. By pressing the action button, you perform a jump, but if you bump into something, while jumping or not, the shell will break and the costume falls off and disappears. In other words, you'll lose the costume if you try to do anything even slightly unusual. However, the costume has the ability to draw in all the drops from a slightly further away. It really feels like an achievement when you clear a stage with this delicate, easily broken costume. But what about the story? Yuji Naka made games tend to never focus on the story too much, and it's a field that the man himself admits his own weakness in. Stories... To be honest, I'm not really the type of developer who focuses on a game's script. I always emphasize how a game feels and the action, while the story may be a bit weak. I wasn't very good with stories. So, how would he think of a story to satisfy the Squeenix Phoenix who was all about stories? Novels, motherfucker, novels! One of the ideas at the core of Balan's design was appealing to everybody, regardless of nationality or language. In the same way that old cartoons like Tom and Jerry are so popular the world over, Balan would breach all barriers and be a game that anybody could enjoy. How it would end up doing this was by including every language currently spoken and by keeping any story to a purely visual medium. No need to translate problems that can be understood without any language, like this guy. He likes chess, and this girl. A dolphin killed her. But Balan lives in such a rich and fleshed out world that people want to be in, they just don't know it yet. So Yuji Naka decided to hire the best and brightest to bring Balan's world of wonder to life. Some guy he knew. Okay, that's underselling it a bit. Soshi Kawasaki is an accomplished writer in his own right, having written the long-arm series of detective novels. He was also a former employee of Sega, which is how Yuji Naka most likely made the connection. Jane Austen's a punk. Could she have written Yoshi's Island DS? Out of him popped Balan Wonderworld, Maestro of Mystery, Theater of Wonders. A 190-page long book, which, let's be real, I'm gonna have to read one day. But not today. This book explained just about everything the game chose to leave out, like Chess Guy. His name's Cal, and he's miserable because he got so angry over losing a chess game that he didn't notice that his wife was dying, and by the time he calmed down after losing to a child, his wife was dead. This is where the story of the game ended up, and perfectly in line with the idea of Balan as this game that transcends boundaries, it's only available in English and Japanese. So this all sounds like things were going fantastic, I know, but behind closed doors, the game was gently imploding, as the world would get to see when the now infamous Balan Wonderworld demo dropped. And what was the people's takeaway?
Primitive and amateur. If this was made by an indie team in high school, maybe.
But there's no way I'm buying this at full price.
This is the only video game they have in North Korea.
No. Who the hell thought of this?
Balan Wonderworld was 13 wasted hours of my life that I'll never get back.
This was an absolute train wreck of a sneak preview, and all this demo demonstrated is that Yuji Naka hadn't just lost a step, he'd lost the entire marathon. From the demo, people could see that the game controlled awfully. Characters were super slow and clunky, the costumes were basic and underwhelming, and were also tied back to the game's health system. You need certain costumes to advance in the level, and if you lose it, you have to drag yourself all the way back to where it spawns, get one, and try again. Box Fox is in the demo. Box Fox was their best foot forward. At least they're helping people make an informed purchasing decision. Imagine if in a Mario game you couldn't progress in the level if you didn't have the Fire Flower, or you could only beat a Sonic level if you had the Bubble Shield. Not to get to a secret route or finish the level quicker, no, the end of the level is just locked off until you come back with the right tools. Instead of power-ups being a fun incentive to blast through the stage quicker, they're required to get anywhere. And that jump-only playstyle? Well, I kinda lied, because it's not a jump button, it's an action button. The player character's action is that they get to jump, but for a costume like Dainty Dragon, their action is breathing fire. Which means they can't jump at all. People also figured out that those 80 costumes were an exercise in redundancy. You know what, let's keep ganging up on Dainty Dragon. So its ability is to breathe fire, which can destroy blocks. But so can Tornado Wolf, and so can Pumpkin Puncher, which both have abilities that make them way more useful than Dainty Dragon. Dynamic Dolphin can swim through certain water blocks, but so can Jelly Jolt, and that even has an extra attack. Then there were costumes like Elastiplant, where you got to see that there was no idea they'd say no to. The story didn't make any sense, it didn't look especially good. This demo did long-lasting damage to the public's perception of the game. People got to see what the Balan Company was cooking, and it looked burnt. Noriyoshi Fujimoto was sent to try to put the fires out and tell fans that things were gonna get better. As for the demo, based on the feedback we've received, we took another look at some areas and will be implementing a day one patch to rebalance these. Specifically, we've adjusted the character controls, which includes increasing movement speed slightly, improved the camera, and rebalanced the difficulty in the latter half of the game. Obviously, they were way too late into the development process to change any of those fundamental issues that were rotting Balan from the inside out, but these fixes would be enough to save things, right? Balan Wonderworld was pulverized, ripped apart just like it had been in demo form, except instead of a few stages, it was a full-length game. Everything people hated from the demo was carried over to the main game. So the people got what they were promised. It would be dishonest to make a good game now. Of those 80 costumes, around 5 were fun to use, and when those aren't available, you gotta trudge through some of the worst level design in the business. I've said before that the game peaks at about a 5 out of 10, but playing through it again made me realize just how horrible that early game is. I wouldn't want to go through it if it wasn't something I had to do, and it's clear that any amount of polish that was applied was slapped onto the back half, and not where it was needed most. So the game comes out, flops spectacularly, and the Balan Wonderworld Twitter account has to soldier on like there's no problem. Bing bang boom, we're done here, right? Well, no. A year later, it turns out that Yuji Naka has left Squeenix, and now he's suing them, now he's making a bunch of claims and posting doctored photos, and now he's going to jail. What happened? Gear up, boys and girls. We got our speculative suspenders and slander slacks on because almost all the info we're about to go over comes from Yuji Naka, and given what's going on, I trust that guy just about as far as I can throw him. So let's just try to go over what we know. After Balan Wonderworld's release in 2021, Yuji Naka revealed in April of 2022 that he had been removed from Balan Wonderworld's development 6 months prior to release, due to a vote of no confidence from everyone else on the team. Who else? The producers, the developers, the artists, human resources. He was even starting trouble with the sound guys. How do you piss them off? This would have been made public sooner, but due to his pending lawsuit against Squeenix over his removal, he's had to stay silent. Yuji Naka claims the reason for his removal was him voicing complaints over a lack of polish and Arzest refusing to fix bugs. This does have a lot of merit, considering the day one patch needed to include a fix to stop a strobe effect in the final boss that could induce seizures. Oh crap, I forgot I had this graphic. Arzest, in their defense, had never developed an HD game before and rarely worked on consoles. Moreover, the fact that Balan was releasing on everything from the Switch to the PC to the PS5. They were working on hardware that nobody knew. Not an excuse for the game's poor performance, but more than a valid explanation. Yuji Naka also revealed that another problem he had during development was that a song was used in one of the game's trailers that was created by a YouTuber and not the game's composer. He explained that I thought it was wrong that a piano arrangement of the game's music by a YouTuber was used in promotion for an original game. When I insisted the original song be released, it caused trouble. This is a weird problem to have, and an even bigger one to bring up after the game came out, but it could be a situation where this spat over music was part of a larger struggle within development about control. Yuji Naka is somebody with a proven track record of wanting games developed his way, and if the best way to present that to make him look good is to mention a problem with the music, that's what he's gonna put out there. He ended off his rant with, "Personally, I believe it is a true disgrace that Balan Wonderworld was released in the state that it was in. I wanted to show the world an action game in its proper light. Therefore, I believe that Square Enix and Arzest are companies that care neither about games nor their fans." The whole breakdown of problems with Balan's development cycle was cataloged on Yuji Naka's Twitter account, which will become important later, but as for what we have right now to work with, there are two major problems with the story that stop it from sitting right. First is that Yuji Naka was unanimously agreed to be unfit for the directorial position and was removed. Even if you believe there was some shadowy conspiracy in the background to oust him from power, and if you do, hi Yuji Naka, but even then, unanimous. Nobody wanted to keep Yuji Naka around, and that speaks to a major problem with his leadership style. He's the head of the Balan Company. It was created for him. He would have had a hand in selecting who he wanted on the team and what positions to put them in. Despite that, he still found a way to piss them all off to the degree that not one wanted him around. And secondly, Yuji Naka was removed as director 6 months before the game was set to be released. Just like a lot of people, I assume that developers find finished games on their doorsteps after storks deliver them, but it's actually a lot of hard work. 6 months out from a game's completion is often considered the polishing phase, where problems are ironed out and the game gets ready for release. The core game is essentially finished by this point, and that means that any major changes to things like level design, costumes, and pacing are impossible. If Yuji Naka was indeed part of the development team for those last 6 months, none of those options would or even could have been addressed, and the game would ship in a very similar state to the one it did. The wheels were set in motion for Balan's failures well before Yuji Naka was kicked out, and there was nothing that could be done afterwards to fix it. But let's go back to Yuji Naka's Twitter for a moment. Oh yeah, by the way, thought I should mention it about now, Yuji Naka is 57 years old. While the pending lawsuit was still in the litigation station, Yuji Naka took the time to celebrate the 26th anniversary of Nights. He even posted a photo of the development team to go along with it, and oh, that's why I recognize that track. I tell you, nobody makes better music for games than Yawning Black Abyss. Yuji Naka had scribbled somebody out of the Knight's development photo before uploading it, and it doesn't take much sleuthing to figure out it was Naoto Oshima, the same guy who developed his 2 most famous characters and was his most recent collaborator. This was not a good look for Yuji Naka. It painted him as petty and vindictive following his very public breakup with Squeenix. Speak of the devil, it takes 2 to tango, and Naka's class action cut-a-rug partner had this to say about the lawsuit. They had nothing to say about the lawsuit, just saying, yeah, there is one, and Balan Wonderworld is a game we recommend with confidence. I don't know about that. But that wasn't even the biggest Balan-related story of that year, as by November 17th, Yuji Naka had been arrested for insider trading related to Dragon Quest Tact. What insider trading is using information not available to the public to trade on the stock market for a profit. If you have information that no one else does, you have an unfair advantage on what's supposed to be a free market, and it comes with some serious consequences. Yuji Naka's position at Squeenix gave him access to confidential information that a company called Aiming was selected to develop the new mobile game, and seeing as it's a Dragon Quest game released in Japan, there was a lot of money to be made. These are games that have to be released on Sundays just so they don't accidentally tank the Japanese economy. Yuji Naka used this knowledge to purchase over 2.8 million yen, or $20,000, worth of stock in Aiming, so that when it was announced the company would be developing such a high-profile mobile game, he could sell off the stock for massive profit. He wasn't the only Squeenix employee implicated either, as Taisuke Sasaki and Fumaki Suzuki were also caught buying $47 million worth of yen in Aiming stock. Sasaki and Suzuki. This is some Tweedledee and Tweedledum level crime. Get serious. While that case was pending, though, Yuji Naka was arrested again for a second case of insider trading. This time it was related to Final Fantasy The First Soldier, a game you can't even buy anymore. This case is way more severe for a lot of reasons, like how First Soldier was more pushed globally than Dragon Quest. It's part of the wider Final Fantasy VII reboot plan, which meant it was certain to be a hit in spite of itself, and Yuji Naka didn't purchase 2.8 million yen worth of stock. He purchased 144 million yen worth of stock. This totals well over $1 million worth of stock that he purchased with information not available to the public, and on March 2nd of this year, Yuji Naka pled guilty to the allegations related to the First Soldier in his first trial held at Tokyo District Court. What does this mean? Well, I'm no expert on Japanese law, but that doesn't mean I can't try to be one. So according to this document from the Japanese Exchange Group, which summarizes insider trading regulations, the typical punishment for somebody found guilty of insider trading is up to 5 years in jail and $5 million in fines. Though that could have changed, because all the way back in 2010, Nomura Holdings, one of the largest Japanese financial conglomerates, was found to be doing insider trading. Many members of the public complained that they got off too lightly, and since then the Japanese Japanese Security and Exchange Surveillance Commission has sought harsher punishments in insider trading cases. Whether those changes have been implemented since the Exchange Group document in 2016 is hard to figure out, but whether or not it's gotten worse, it still bodes very poorly for Yuji Naka's chances. And that's where the story ends for now. No new news about the ongoing trial has been made public, and the man who made Sonic is currently stuck in legal limbo awaiting a potential 5 years in jail. Yuji Naka has had one of the most complicated and controversial careers in games. His career spanned all the way from the start of home consoles to the modern day, and in that time he's done a lot of good, but just as much bad. What happened to projects like Geist Force and Sonic Extreme is terrible, his treatment of Naoto Oshima and Hirokazu Yasuhara is completely out of line, and his penchant for taking credit he doesn't deserve on games he barely worked on is just icing on the cake. He's a passionately creative guy, but these stories make it clear that he has no way of tempering that creativity for the sake of the people around him. It's true that one of my favorite franchises and also two 3DS Street Pass games wouldn't exist without him, but that doesn't mean he's immune to criticism. Making Sonic 2 is great, but that doesn't mean you can't be called out when you're doing something objectively scummy. Another year, another Balan case closed. It's been a long road, and there's plenty more miles ahead, but I got my walking shoes on. Maybe someday I'll read a book. Maybe someday I'll rate all the costumes. Maybe I'll get lazy and forget to do it next year, and then, well, fuck, I can't just skip a year and go back. That's ridiculous. I should write myself a note. However, that's in the future, and right here in the here and now, there are other fish that need frying. This is the worst funeral I've ever been to. The gravediggers didn't even show up.